for centuries all across the world. In the United States, slavery arose nearly as soon as the first settlers came. The first African slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619 when tobacco emerged as a major cash crop. From there, slavery spread throughout the colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. Over time, slavery became more concentrated in the South due to the fact that the southern land was better suited for large-scale farming. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, it further solidified the importance of slavery to the Southern economy. Slaves were treated as property rather than people. They were sold just as possessions, and oftentimes families were ripped apart due to these sales. Often slaves were beaten, whipped, sexually abused, and sometimes even killed. The slaves were forced to work long hours every day and slept in small, overcrowded quarters. The harsh and inhumane treatment of these slaves caused widespread controversy between slaveholders and abolitionists across the country. Sometimes abolitionists would work towards freedom by either raising awareness of the horrors of slavery or even assisting slaves in escaping from their masters and gaining freedom.
I'm Harriet Tubman. Before I ever became a conductor of the Underground Railroad, I was a slave, just like my parents before me. My father was owned by a man named Anthony Thompson, and my mother was owned by Mary Patterson Broadus. Slavery, however, severed our family ties, as did countless others. During my enslavement, 3 of my sisters were sold to plantations far away, causing me to lose contact with them. Although my mother tried to resist separation of our family, it was little use. She was only successful one time with my youngest brother named Moses. When slave owners attempted to buy Moses, my mother refused and ultimately stopped them from purchasing him. I think that the strength of my mother really set an example for me later on in life. My life in slavery was almost unbearable. One day I was whipped 5 times before breakfast. Another day I was walking to a dry goods store, the name I cannot recall, when I came across a disobedient slave and an overseer. The overseer wanted me to help restrain the other slave. When I refused, I was struck on the head by a 2-pound weight. This caused me to have seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes. I eventually escaped from slavery. However, I was determined to not let anyone else endure the horrors that I did, which is why I became a conductor of the Underground Railroad.
The abolitionist movement was at the heart of the Underground Railroad. Established in the early 1800s, the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. Rather, it was a network of secret routes and safe houses that were used by slaves in order to escape to free states or to Canada. Oftentimes, activity regarding the Underground Railroad took place in states bordering slave states. Ohio specifically was a major center of activity. The Underground Railroad was successful in rescuing many enslaved people. An estimated 100,000 slaves escaped bondage between 1810 and 1850. The Underground Railroad also had a set of code names. Abolitionists who frequently assisted slaves in their journey to freedom were often referred to as conductors. Typically, the safe houses, which provided slaves with protection, food, and a place to sleep, were referred to as stations. Those who hid the slaves in the safe houses were known as station masters. When slaves were safe with a station master, they became cargo. There were even code names that helped slaves find their way to the north. For example, the Big Dipper, whose handle points towards the North Star, was referred to as the drinking gourd. One of the most well-known and influential conductors was a former slave named Harriet Tubman. She was credited with rescuing hundreds of African Americans from slavery. Tubman is even referred to as the Moses of her people.
There was a large bounty being offered for my capture, so I always had to be careful. At one point, the reward for my capture totaled $40,000. Not only was I a fugitive slave myself, but I was breaking even more laws by helping other slaves escape. The slave I was leading became scared and changed his or her mind about escaping to freedom. This is my least favorite part of being a conductor. I knew that if I let them turn around and return to their master, it would endanger not only myself, but also the other slaves I was leading. Instead, I would draw my gun and tell them that they can either be free or die a slave.
You can either die a slave or be free.
All in all, I made 19 trips to Maryland and helped over 300 slaves achieve freedom. Of the slaves I rescued, 2 of them were my 70-year-old parents.
Although many former slaves, such as Harriet Tubman, became leading supporters of the Underground Railroad, there were also many white abolitionists that also became very involved. Historians have often traced origins of the Underground Railroad to the Quakers in the late 1780s. This would explain why a larger portion of the Underground Railroad supporters, such as Abigail Goodwin, were Quakers. Although not all Underground Railroad supporters were Quakers, many were religious due to the fact that the Christianity in particular tends to emphasize the equality before God. The event concerning the Underground Railroad oftentimes generated support from white abolitionists who weren't necessarily conductors, such as the famous author Harriet Beecher Stowe. My name is Abigail Goodwin. I emerged as an active figure in the Underground Railroad movement. My sisters and I were fervent abolitionists, causing us to come into contact with leading anti-slavery figures such as William Still, Lucretia Mott, and orator James Miller McKim. From then on, my home became a prominent beacon for freedom seekers, providing them with many clothes, food, and funds.
Hello, my name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. You may know me from my famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. However, what many people don't know is I was also somewhat involved in the Underground Railroad. I have always been a strong supporter of the Underground Railroad and an advocate for abolition. I was able to interview a number of former slaves who had escaped slavery via Underground Railroad. It was through these interviews and my visits to Kentucky, where I witnessed slavery firsthand, that I was able to fully understand how truly awful slavery was. In 1836, I married my husband, Calvin Ellis Stowe, and we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio for the next few years. During our time in Ohio, we continued to meet numerous former slaves that had escaped slavery due to the Underground Railroad. We ended up hiring a former slave as a servant girl. She, by the laws of Ohio, was free since her mistress had brought her to Cincinnati and allowed her to stay there. After a few months, however, the girl's master came into town looking to seize her and force her back into slavery. My husband and my brother did not let this happen. One night they armed themselves and drove the girl in a covered wagon on lesser-known roads to the home of a trusted friend. Here she would be safe from her master. This incident became the inspiration behind how the fugitives escape in the novel I would write nearly a decade later.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. River running free, you know how I feel. Blossom on a tree, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good.